Morning. Once again, a good morning to each of you, and a blessing to see everyone here today. Appreciate Haoshin leading that song, although it might be a little bit out of touch with this country. You see, in Malaysia, the money is called ringgit. All right, and so when you want to take the message true and glad to the sinful and the sad, what do you have to do? Ring it out. All right. The ring it. It's a giving song, really, but I know we dollars out doesn't really sound as good as ring it out, I suppose. Anyway, could change it, but anyway. Nehemiah chapter 10 is going to be our focus this morning. Interesting to make that joke because obviously there is something that we can take from giving in relationship to our subject today, the idea of consecration. Consecration. All right, and if this is not a familiar term with you, hopefully it will be by the end of the lesson. Before we get into it, though, I want to draw your minds to a bit of an illustration. Imagine you owned a piece of property. Because I don't know what the laws are here in Australia regarding this, let's just say it's a piece of property in the United States. And I don't know how big a hectare is. I know how big an acre is. But I'll say hectare, and just for the sake of argument, all right? So imagine you had a 1,000-hectare piece of property in the United States, all right? And you decided that you were going to sell that piece of property, all right? But there was going to be one stipulation. You were going to keep 1 hectare in the very center of that 1,000-hectare piece of property, all right? You know that if you did that in the United States, according to United States law, you would be able to connect your 1 hectare to the nearest road by a really long driveway. All right? And so you would bisect all of that land that you had sold to get that 1 hectare piece of property that was yours. And so by reserving that one little piece of property, you ensure that you always have access to it. All right? Now I want you to think about that as it relates to our hearts. All right? And imagine that you're not, I know that we don't sell our hearts to God, we give our hearts to God, but imagine that you're selling your heart to God. And imagine that you're going to give all of your heart to God, except for that little bit. I don't know what you put in that little bit. Maybe it's your work, that you really hold your work in your heart, or maybe it's your family relationships. You're really going to hold that in your heart, or whatever it might be. You're holding back some of your heart from the Lord. What's going to happen? Well, there's going to be access from the road of ideas and the road of life into your heart. And you know who's going to use that road? Satan's going to use that road. If you leave your hearts open, then take, you don't have to worry about it too much. Just take rest in this fact. Satan is going to take advantage of it. All right? It's going to happen. All right? You cannot withhold anything from the Lord and truly serve Him. And that kind of sets us up for the idea that we're going to be talking about here with the idea of consecration. In Nehemiah chapter 10, which you might have guessed does follow chapter 9, but we saw at the close of chapter 9 that there were people who were going to enter into a vow. And so Nehemiah chapter 10 begins with a list of people who determined that they were going to enter into a vow. They're going to make a solemn promise to serve the Lord. And they want everyone to know. It's kind of like one of those, accountability kind of situations. We're going to have our names written down on this list, and Nehemiah's going to record it, and all of us are entering into this vow, and we are going to serve the Lord. The principle that they are enacting in this chapter is the principle of consecration. And when we study the vow that they took and the words of their vow and the attitude in it, we can see exactly how, or rather what consecration looks like for us today and how we can apply it to our lives. All right? Because it's a very, very important thing. And always, I was just thinking about this relative to even the lesson this morning. It's bad when the teacher learns something from his own lesson. But you just reflect on certain things after you say things. And I was reflecting on this in the worship service, how profound their periods of worships were with how little knowledge they had, and how little they knew about God, and yet how much that meant to them. And as you're thinking about that attitude of adoration, allow that to flow into this idea of consecration. So let's begin with a discussion, first of all, of what consecration is. I don't take it for granted that you know what that term means. So let's give you some definitions of the term. First of all, consecration is a solemn commitment of your life to your or your time to some cherished purpose, to a service or goal. All right? So a solemn commitment of your life. Second, sanctification of something by setting it apart, usually with religious rites, as dedicated to God. Now, again, these are secular definitions, but whenever you come across in secular dictionaries, you look in WordWeb or Webster's or whatever dictionary you might use, and you see something relating to God in the definition, then you can almost guarantee that it has something to do with you. It's a word that you need to know, or at least you need to know the concept behind the word. And so the idea here with this word is that we are giving a promise and we're giving a commitment, and that commitment has, strength to it, and things are really going to be transferred over to God in this way. So as we think about consecration from this secular definition, now let's go into the Bible itself. We looked at previously the idea of conversation, and we noticed how in the term conversation there was a richer meaning in the Greek text than there was in the Hebrew text, and we saw several ways or several concepts that came across with that one word conversation. It was actually the opposite in this term, consecration. Consecration or consecrate is a word that is found throughout the Old Testament, at least in the King James Version, but it's translated from several different words, and each of them gives you a little bit of an idea of what it is to consecrate something. So consecrate in the Old Testament is actually taken from 4 words, and I put words or phrases. In one of the examples that we're going to give, and I think probably the best example of what it really is to consecrate, you're going to see that the translators took a phrase and they put it into this word consecration. All right, so we're not going to bother trying to pronounce these words, but I do encourage you to write down the references so that you can have a look at these words, and maybe you can do your own word studies to try to back this up. But the first word found, for example, and that's what e.g. means, by the way, just an example of where that's found in the Bible, not the only case. But in Micah chapter 4 and verse 13, the word there that's translated consecrate means to devote or to dedicate. And so, when you dedicate something, you're saying, I'm going to do it for this purpose, or I'm going to give it to this purpose. We sometimes see charity races run, and they are dedicated. The race is dedicated to a certain charity. All the proceeds, all that is earned from that is going to be given to that charity. So to devote or to dedicate is one idea that flows into the word consecration. A second idea that flows into the word consecration is this word, which is found in Numbers 6:7. Now, I won't say the word, but I will say the one that comes into English. You've heard of a Nazirite vow? Remember studying the Old Testament and reading people sometimes, you saw people taking that vow, John the Baptist, Samson, other people who took the Nazirite vow. Well, this was a vow that was a symbol of separation. You didn't cut your hair, you didn't eat the things that other people ate. You behaved differently for a period of time, and you devoted that period of time over to God. All right, and so the idea of separation flows into the idea of consecration. Third, the idea of that is found with the word that's in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 19, to sanctify, to be holy. And so not only is this a thing that has been, when it's consecrated, a thing that has been separated, but it's also a thing that's been set apart. Things can be separate from each other and still have something to do with each other. But when something has been sanctified, it is not only separate from other things, but it's set apart from those things. It's distinct from them, has nothing to do with them. All right? And that flows into the idea of consecration. All of these things are things that should be describing our heart and our relationship with God. But probably the best image, really, that we get of consecration comes from that phrase that is translated consecration. The word that is actually 2 words, as you see there in the phrase. Exodus chapter 29 is an example of where this is found. And it actually means to fill the hand. It's a word that they use to refer to this action they took before they gave it to God. And so they consecrated it, and then they gave it to God. But it's a word picture. It's not meant to be literally that they just put it in their hand, all right? It's a word picture. And it's something that meant to them that when we're going to set apart something for the use of God, we're not going to give him the scraps. We're not going to give him the leftovers. We're not going to give him part. We're not going to give him, just a little bit in our hand. Our hand has to be full, and we're going to give all of it to God. And that's the idea of consecration, really. If you can understand that picture, the idea of filling up your hands with your heart and then handing the whole thing over to God, that's consecration. That's what it is. Now, as you think about that meaning, what's the importance of that meaning? Well, quite simply, that's what we are expected to do. All right, we are expected to give ourselves fully over to God. Our bodies are said to be a living sacrifice. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. When you think about the difference, really, one of the differences between the Old Covenant and the New, or the Old Testament and the New Testament, they gave, generously to God on many occasions. But what were they always given? All right? Unless there was an understanding, like we see here in Nehemiah chapter 10, of something greater happening, oftentimes the Jews kind of fell into this understanding that I give something that is apart from me to God. We can fall into that same understanding if we're not careful, where, we treat like our contribution on Sunday, we treat it more like a donation. All this is my money, and I've got this little bit that I'm going to give to God, and that's mine, that's His. All right? But if we think about it properly, then we're not viewing it like that. And it's always been that way, but the Christians are obviously living under the New Testament. That's the standard to which we're called. All right? We don't give something that is apart from us, but in the New Covenant, what do? We give ourselves. We present ourselves. All that we are, all that we have belongs to God. And so He comes first in every aspect of our lives when we have truly consecrated ourselves to Him. And so that's why it's important. We are to offer ourselves as living sacrifices. But not only that, we are not only to offer ourselves as living sacrifices, but even if we think that we might hold a little back, we can't. We can't and expect to have taken, to be in possession of Jesus Christ or to be in fellowship with Him. Why? Well, He said to us twice through His servant Paul that we were bought with a price. When you buy something, imagine going to the grocery store and buying a loaf of bread, and then, the Woolies president or whatever, he comes to your door, I need a couple of pieces of bread back. Can you imagine that? You say, I bought it. It's mine. Why should I give you this couple of pieces of bread? All right? How ridiculous of a picture is that? Well, it's the same picture when we say, here, God, here's my life, but then let me have a little bit of it back. Let me have a little bit of my time. Let me have my money. Let me have this aspect of my life. Let me keep it. It doesn't make sense, does it? We were bought with a price, and therefore consecration is important. Now, understanding that it's important is one thing, but what does it look like? What does consecration look like? You can say, give it all to God, but how does that function? Well, Nehemiah chapter 10 is actually going to show us that. As we get into the chapter, we're going to be noticing the anatomy of consecration. When you look at, or when you do a study of anatomy, you're looking at something for its various parts and components, right? And that's the idea that we're going to approach this chapter and see in this solemn vow that they take what it looks like when people have really consecrated themselves to God. Okay, so let's walk through this chapter now. And let's notice that consecration begins with a vow. And this is what we've read already, but let's walk through it again. Verse 28. The rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinims, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the land unto the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, everyone having knowledge and having understanding. And so this is an adult decision that they're making, and only for those who are adults. And you see that this massive group of people has joined into it. Their names have been listed in verses 1 through 27. What do? Verse 29, they clave to their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse. We'll think about that in just a second. And into an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God, and His judgments, and His statutes. Now, as you think about this vow, notice the components of it. Notice what you see happening here. First of all, the vow involves everyone. All right? This is a total buy-in by this community. They're all participating in this vow together. If we really want to have a strongly defended church today, if we want to have a strong church in the same way that these people wanted to have a strong city, then we all have to buy into the vow that we made. And we'll compare what we've done as Christians with what we see here. But we have entered into a vow, realize it. When we were baptized into Christ and we said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and we, in faith, obeyed Him, putting on Christ in baptism, we were saying something to God in that, more than just saying, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. We were saying, God, I believe that you will forgive my sins and that you will take away my sins when I obey this action of baptism, and I promise to walk in newness of life after this. I promise to do my best to avoid sin and to serve Christ. It's an oath. And so as you think about it, it involves everyone, and has to involve everyone for us as well. It was a vow to obey God and His law. And how did they understand that? What did that look like? You see three terms being used here. The law which was given by Moses, but then you see the commandments, the judgments, and the statutes. Now, there are different uses of these words, but the way that I understand these three words is as follows, that you see that they were keeping, or made a vow to keep all of His commandments. I think of this as what He positively instructed them to do, the thou shalt, all right, if you will. They said, we're going to do all of the thou shalt. We're going to do all of the things that we are required to do. But then, interestingly, not only all of His commandments, but all of His judgments. You know, sometimes things have sort of a knock-on effect. And you sign your, like if you're signing a contract, you sign to a certain set of terms without really realizing the impact of it. That's why we have in Australia this cooling off period, right? Because sometimes we sign the contract, we agree to the terms, but we didn't realize what those terms implied. And so realizing the implication, we say, all right, I can't do this. Well, God's commandments have implications, right? And you can call those His judgments. All right. So what is implied by what God has commanded? They're saying we want that as well. We're going to take the implications of this contract. We want that as well. That they agree to enter into a vow keeping all of His commandments, His judgments, but third, His statutes. I think of that in terms of all that He's asked negatively, or you can say the thou shalt nots. And so they're saying we're going to do all that He asks positively, avoid all the things that He asks negatively, and if that impacts anything else in our lives, we'll agree to that as well. And that's what a vow looks like, a vow of consecration. You see not only that it was a vow that involved everyone, a vow that was to obey God and His law, but it was a vow that was not to be taken lightly. And so they used the idea or the understanding that they were entering into not just a vow, but a curse. Now the curse isn't the vow if it's kept, all right? They're not saying, we want bad things to happen to us. No, they're saying, we understand the weight of this. And we understand that if we don't fulfill our end of the agreement, that God is going to punish us. All right? And so we're taking the vow, realizing the negative side of it as well. Now as we think about ourselves today, we need to enter into a vow in our hearts and in our minds of consecration, because we already took a vow when we were baptized. We already said, God, I give you my life. We were already bought with a price. And so do we treat our vow like a vow? Have we agreed to involve everyone in this vow? You know, if you are a part of a family, you know, is your family buying into this vow with you? You know, you bring them along to church, but are you making sure that everyone is entering into this vow together? It's so often the case when you have generational Christianity that invariably you'll find that you have some really dedicated grandparents, some halfway dedicated parents, not so dedicated grandchildren. It happens very often. I don't know what's happened in your family. But this is a vow that everyone that had understanding entered into. So it involved the entire family unit, involved everyone. Does our vow involve a complete understanding as it is here? You know, we say to God, I want forgiveness of sins. That's wonderful. But do we understand the requirements of it? Have we committed to keeping His commandments, His judgments, His statutes? All right? As we think about our vow, do we treat our vow as though it comes with a curse? Because it does come with a curse, did you realize? Christianity comes with a curse. And that is that to turn back and to be entangled again by the world, Peter said it's worse than the beginning. We were talking about that in our Tuesday night class, actually. We had a little bit of a discussion about, the hereafter and what happened in the hereafter. We pointed out that in terms of punishment, there seems to be some greater punishment, be it probably mental, which is what I believe, but at the very least it's stated that there's some kind of punishment for those who have known the way of truth and turn away from it. It's a vow with great blessings, but it's a curse if you turn from it. Do you understand it? Do you treat it like that and give it that kind of weight in your life? That's what consecration requires. Now, consecration also does an amazing thing. Consecration creates unity among those who have been consecrated. Now you notice that in verse 29, they clave to their brethren, their nobles, and then they entered into the vow. The reason that, one of the amazing characteristics really of Christianity is that when we are baptized into Christ, what does God do? He adds us to the church. That's for our benefit. Because if you really allow yourself to be truly aligned with others who are like-minded and who have also made this vow, if we make this vow together, the whole thing becomes a lot easier. All right? Because we can look out for each other. This is also something, when we finished our discussion on that on Tuesday night, we saw Ecclesiastes 4, 9 through 12, and that reading there talks about the danger of being alone. If you're alone, you fall, who's going to pick you up? Well, no one. All right? The vow becomes a lot easier to keep when you truly buy into this community. It's not easy to keep a vow if your only involvement in the community of those who have also kept the vow is only to see them once a week. All right? Just being honest about the way this all works. The more you buy into the community, the more you make these people a part of your lives, the more that you do what that word implies, clave. What cleaving is, more that you do what that word implies, which is to stick close to, the easier the vow becomes. So it creates unity, but then it also, if you think about it, it demands unity. If you're going to be true to your vow of consecration, you need to keep the vow with others. And that's why He added you to the church, or that's why God added you to the church. And consecration, though, as we continue to walk forward in the chapter, we see that no area of our lives is left out of the picture. Nothing is withheld from God. In verse 30, it says, "And that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. And if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals, food, on the Sabbath day," so they're bringing goods and food on the Sabbath day, "to sell, that we would not buy it of them on the Sabbath day, or on the holy day. And that we would leave the 7th year and the exaction of every day." Now, if you're not familiar with the way that their way of law of Moses worked, right? A lot of people don't think about how much of a law of faith it was. Because at the end of every 7-year cycle, so 6 years pass, the Sabbath day, right? You know what they did. They worked 6 days, and then they took the 7th day, and they consecrated it, they gave it to God. But they also worked 6 years, and then they consecrated the 7th year to God. Now, can you imagine? You're a farmer, right? And you're growing crops every single year. Well, if you don't grow crops for a whole year, you realize how big of a faith exercise that is? Because you're not going to get crops for that year. But then when the cycle begins again, you're going to still have to plant crops in that, the first year of the second cycle. You have to plant crops, and then you're going to have to then wait till the end of that year. It's a 2-year commitment. A 2-year commitment to, and why are they doing it? Well, God has commanded them to do it. And it's an exercise in trust. Do you trust me to provide for you? Because what God said He would do if they did this is that He would allow the land to produce. and that the remnants of their harvesting would produce in that 7th year and provide them enough to make them through that 8th year, if you will, or the first year of the new cycle, until the new crops grew. And so they said, well, we're going to do that. It was an exercise in trust, and they said, we're going to do that. Now, as you think about this, you see, therefore, different aspects on display, and very deep aspects that meet fundamental needs. You know, working to get food. Marriage is a fundamental part of our lives. But they say, we're going to give even these things to God. The first verse there, verse 30, you see them making commitment not to marry off their daughters to anyone in the land. Now, it's hard for us to imagine this situation because we generally pick our spouses, right? We date and that kind of thing happens. But in those days, the majority of the marriages were arranged. And arranged marriages were, generally for the benefit of children, but also and often marriages were arranged to create harmony among the community. All right, and so families would show their harmony and their union by these arranged marriages. What are the Jews committing to doing by saying that they're not going to give their daughters to the people of the land? Law of Moses required it, that's one thing, but what are they actually committing to do when they did that? They're committing to being hated by everyone around them. Because they're going to say that the Samaritans and all these other people around them are going to say, we give our daughters to these people, and what are you? You're not going to be a part of us? You're not going to be one of us? And they're surrounding themselves by antagonism, but they say, we don't care, because God has commanded it. And further, when we look again at that fact, verse 31, where they're making this agreement to say, we're not going to do anything on the Sabbath day. Moses has commanded us not to work. We're not going to work on the Sabbath day. We're going to leave off the 7th year. And I didn't talk about that last bit, the exaction of every debt. Debts also were dissolved in the year of Jubilee. Every 50 years, all the debts vanished away. And I think that I'm a little bit shaky on my laws regarding that. I have to look at that again myself. But they basically the requirement was, and at the end of every 7 years, if they had a servant that had indentured himself to them for the repayment of some debt, they had to let them go. No matter what the debt was, they had to let it go and forgive the debt. What are they doing? This is a commitment of their money, isn't it? What if the Gentiles come around on the Sabbath day and they say, we've got a really good deal? 5 for 1 or something like that. Not even buy one, get one free. 5 for 1, we'll make you a great deal. Well, it doesn't matter. We're not going to buy it. Whatever the financial loss was, they didn't care, because they were committing themselves over to the Lord. Can we really demonstrate our consecration with anything less than what they did here? We get so worried about, in cultures around the world, people worry about marriage, and so they think they have to compromise values in order just to find a marriage partner. It's wonderful, though, when people can have a set of values and a standard and say that I want to marry a person who's going to help me to get to heaven, and have that be an uncompromising foundational truth. I know that a lot of marriages, maybe in this audience, they haven't began that way, all right? But at the same time, to protect the church going forward, shouldn't our children be taught to marry people who help them to get to heaven? And then to have that be the number one guideline? As you think about the other side of the financial commitment that they're making, how much of a financial commitment have we made? Have we said, no, I won't take that promotion because I know that that's going to cause me to neglect my responsibilities to the Lord, and I know it's going to cause me to neglect my responsibilities to my family, and which the Lord has told me that if I don't, bring up my children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, that I'm in trouble, broken one of His commandments. Have I withheld myself from gain for the sake of putting Him first? So consecration involves all that we have. Consecration also involves making sure that the work of God is provided for. In verse 32, as we continue forward, we made ordinances for us to charge ourselves yearly with a third part of a shekel for the service of the house of God. And so every year they're going to take 33%. Third part of a shekel, or unless if that's each shekel that they have, or if that's just the requirement of each person. Either way, they're making a financial commitment to, verse 33, for the showbread, for the continual meat offering, the continual burnt offering, and of the Sabbaths, of the new moons, of the feasts, and for the holy things, for the sin offerings, to make an atonement for Israel, and for all the work of the house of our God. In the Old Testament, it wasn't as simple as you've committed a sin, you bring an animal, and you offer a sacrifice. In order for God's laws to be kept, there had to be continual sacrifices being offered, and for various reasons. And financial burdens, therefore, were being placed upon God's people because animals and all that they had represented wealth. And so these had to be provided for in some way. But they're saying, we're going to make sure that God is worshipped. We're going to make sure that this temple continues to roll along as it's supposed to. And we're going to sacrifice to do it. How big was the sacrifice? I'm sure it was profound to them. All right? They've already made financial commitments to keep His law in the first place, but we're going to also give generously to make sure that His work is being done, or at least that the resources are there. Interesting, though, they make another vow in consecration. In verse 34, we cast lots among the priests, the Levites, and the people for the wood offering. Now that's a very interesting one. You can do a study of the wood offering and go through the first 5 books of the Bible, frontwards, backwards, upside down. I'll tell you, you're not going to find the wood offering anywhere. There's no wood offering, all right? But what is this wood offering? Well, there's not a wood offering, but there is a requirement for a continual fire to burn at the temple. All right, so a fire has to burn all the time. What does it take for a fire to burn? I know that we take it for granted. If you've gone to Melbourne, you go in front of that river, the Yarra River, and in front of the Crown Casino, they have these flames that continually burn all the time, natural gas. All right, and so we take for granted that before you have natural gas piped into the place, and before you have electricity, and all that, you have wood, and you burn wood. It takes wood to keep a fire going, all right? So what are they doing? They're saying God's temple requires a fire. And even though He didn't ask us to make some kind of ordinance relative to this wood, we want to make sure that it's always there. We don't want that fire to go out. And so they're not only trying to make sure that the work is provided for, but they want to actually see that the work is being done. And so they add restrictions upon themselves to make sure that the work is being done. Do we do the same thing? Do we give even more generously just to make sure that God and His work that God is being glorified and His work is being done? Consecration involves giving the best to the Lord as we move forward. Consecration involves giving the best of everything that we have. In verse 35, it says, and bring the first fruits of our ground. What are the first fruits? It does mean the first of what comes, in terms of the harvest and so on. But it means not only the first, but actually also the best. All right? So sometimes in the early, when you go out to a lemon tree, for example, at the beginning of winter, it's got a few little green ones there. Oh, pick a few, give them to God really quick. No, it's not the first and the worst. It's the first and the best. All right? Now follow that word first and look at each time how it's used. We're going to bring the first fruits of our ground, the first fruits of all fruit of all trees, year by year, unto the house of the Lord. Verse 36, also the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, as it is written in the law. Now, the firstborn of our sons, they had to offer an offering for the firstborn to allow there to be that sort of replacement. There was supposed to be a Levitical priest for each of the firstborn sons. But anyway, they're saying we're going to do that. The firstborn of all of our sons and all of our cattle, as it is written in the law, the firstlings of our herds and of our flocks, and to bring to the house of God our God, and to the priests that minister to the house of our God. In verse 37 again, that we should bring the first fruits. They're getting serious now here. The first fruits of our dough, the bread that they make, the first of our offerings, the fruit of all manner of trees, of wine, and of oil even. The oil presses, they're going to give the extra virgin olive oil, that's going to go to God. So the best of everything that they have, and everything that they have, is given over to God. The tithes of our ground and to the Levites, that the same Levites might have the tithes in all the cities of our tillage. So they're going to give the best of every single thing. What do you give to God? I submit that, obviously there's financial considerations to be made, and you can think about whether you gave the best this morning to God or the first this morning to God. But you can also think about, relative to what we talked about in the Bible class hour, adoration, right? This is worship period. And I tell you, if you stay up late on Saturday night, and then you come here on Sunday morning, drag yourself out of bed and slap yourself around, get a few coffees, and here you are. Who got the best? Whatever you did Saturday night got the best. And God got the rest here on Sunday morning. And it happens. But should it happen? Well, it shouldn't happen. In everything that we give to God, we should be giving the best. The absolute best of everything that we have. Consecration involves also protecting what we give to the Lord. In verse 38, the priests, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites take tithes, and the Levites shall bring up the tithes of the tithes, the tenth of the tenth, unto the house of our God, to the chambers, into the treasure house. We're going to not only make sure that all this is gathered, but we want it to be gathered and protected. Gathered and protected. They place their offerings in a secure location. Practical, but we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice to God, don't we? How protected are we with that living sacrifice? The Macedonians were praised by Paul because they gave of themselves first. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 5. Okay. So that's what we're meant to do, actually. There's that which we give on Sunday, but then there's also this which we give every day. So, have we put steps in place to protect our living sacrifice? Have we resisted the devil in our lives? And how do you resist the devil? All right? The picture in James chapter 4 and verse 7, resist the devil and he'll flee from you, makes it seem as though you're like this, resist the devil and he's going to flee. Actually, it doesn't usually work like that, because the other verses that are up there, what do they say? Flee. That's how you resist the devil. You want to resist the devil, you see temptation, and what do? You run away. Flee from fornication. Flee from youthful lust. Flee from these things, Timothy is told in those 3 verses. All right? Run away. You get yourself into a tempting situation, get out of the tempting situation. Don't try to make your strong stand. I mean, there are some times when that's necessary, but there are a lot of times when you just need to get out. All right? You need to turn off the television. You need to close out the internet browser. You need to hang up the phone. Whatever it takes, you need to get out. And do you do that in protecting your living sacrifice? Do you do what it says in Romans 13:14? Do we do this? Make no provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. Give no chance for bad things to happen. Is that the way that you protect yourself? Is that the way that I protect myself? Well, that's what God is calling us to do in consecration. When we consecrate ourselves to the Lord, there is no turning back. We sing that as a song, and it's tragic. I used to sing that song at camp. No turning back, no turning back. And I look around in my mind at the people who were singing that song. How many of them have gone, that left the church, quit it altogether? No turning back. Well, when you've consecrated yourself to the Lord, and not just contributed yourself to the Lord, you give a little donation. When you consecrate yourself to the Lord, there is no turning back. In verse number 39, the children of Israel, the children of Levi, shall bring the offering of the corn, and the new wine, the oil, the chambers where are the vessels of the sanctuary, and the priests that minister, and the porters and the singers. Here's the thought, the key. We will not forsake the house of our God. we will not forsake the house of our God. Hebrews 10:25, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. And we sometimes think that that's only talking about what we're doing right now. The assembling of yourselves, there's a reason why they chose forsake not the assembling of yourselves and not the assembly of yourselves. There's a reason why the translators chose that. All right? They're making a point. All right? Because assembly is what happens when we all come together in one place. But assembling is what's actually supposed to happen. And assembling is where we all contribute and come together. In fact, the literal word actually means to go together with. It's a compound word. It's the three words, go together with, put together. So to go together with. Does that describe you? Are you consecrated, as it says in verse 29, and cleaving to your brethren, and going together with, no turning back? Well, that's what we want to strive for. This morning we have a wonderful opportunity to consecrate ourselves to the Lord. And I want to hold this up to you, not because I actually don't think this man was a New Testament Christian. I don't know much about him. But think about these words and think about the kind of statements that you might make in relationship to your own consecration. Jim Elliot, he was a martyr for his faith. And like I said, I don't know if he was a New Testament Christian or not. But he said this, God, I pray thee, like these idle sticks of my life, that I may burn for thee. Consume my life, my God, for it is thine. I seek not a long life, but a full one, like you, Lord Jesus. What a wonderful statement to make in consecration. A wonderful vow to say, I'm going to give it all to you. Don't want a long life, but I want a full one. And I want it to be full of you. What a thing to strive for. We need to try, as we apply this lesson to our lives, to try to identify some area where we're holding back. I don't know what it is for you. It might be that you're holding back some aspect of your service to this body here. Maybe, even just making a commitment saying, well, when these doors are open, my body's going to be in the seat. That's a shallow form of consecration, but it's still consecration in its early stages. All right? So you say, when these doors are open, my bottom's going to be in the seat, and I'm going to be with God's people, and I'm going to try to cleave to them. All right? And maybe, though, it's something that needs to be corrected in regards to your contribution. Maybe it's in regards to something, your protections that you need to be putting in place in your life to make sure that this goal is really yours. Cleaving unto the Lord, cleaving unto His people, consecrating. Is your hand full as you offer to the Lord, or are you holding back? This morning you have the opportunity, if you have not yet consecrated yourself to the Lord. I don't want you to focus too hard on when I said that it is a curse. It is. But it's a curse only when you turn back. Because I can tell you that you don't want to be on the other side of that equation. There are some I know who are waiting on that decision for some reason to become a Christian. It's the best decision that you'll make. Because if you need any convincing of that, just go back and have a look at chapter 9 of Nehemiah here. And think about the fact that God has always blessed those who have come to Him in faith. And God has always cared for those who have given themselves to Him. And it's a great decision that you can make this morning to put on Christ in baptism and to rise and walk in newness of life. It's a vow, but it's a beautiful and wonderful vow that you won't regret. If you need any help with that this morning, if we can show you anything from the Scriptures to further your understanding, let's talk about these things while we stand and sing this song of invitation.
Let's stand.